our last lessons, we've been discussing the various ways repetition can be used in musical form. We've seen how it can range from the simplest echo of a phrase to a more substantial and varied repeat. Now let's look at recapitulation. This is the term normally used for the last part of a sonata form, where, after an adventurous development, the composer returns to a substantial restatement of material previously heard in the exposition. It can also apply to any substantial return of a musical idea after time spent on other contrasting ideas. In the early classical period, often the recapitulation in the sonata form was very literal, changing only the second theme or group of themes so that they stayed in the tonic instead of modulating away to the dominant or relative major. Gradually, Beethoven and other composers began to explore other ways of using recapitulation. Although its function was originally to round out the form and to give a sense of coming home, more and more recapitulation evolved into another kind of development, usually more stable than the development section, but often presenting the material in novel ways and sometimes in different characters. Today I want to look at the first movement of Mahler's Sixth Symphony, where recapitulation has become much richer and more complex. While there are several important themes in this movement, here I want to focus on how Mahler brings back the second theme. Here it is for the first time in F major. Here this theme is presented in the high strings and woodwind with a very rich accompaniment. There is subtle imitation in the clarinets, contrapuntal figuration in the English horn, bassoons and violas, as well as a rich sustained harmony in the brass, not to mention touches of harp and percussion as well. This presentation arrives at a first climax and then dissolves into another important theme. But then it comes back and is developed further until the exposition ends. Sometimes it maintains its original character, but sometimes it's modified. For example, notice here how the second half of the theme is an augmentation, with note values twice as long. Much later in the movement, the horn and then the strings bring back this idea in the recapitulation. character is at first somewhat calmer than the first time, but then there's a passionate surge. Then it calms down, as it did the first time, but now in D major. Note how the evolution of this theme here is quite different from its first presentation. The first time, the first climax detoured for a while into other material before going on. Now the whole section stays focused on this theme. Because the arrival and departure from this theme, the transitions, are so different from what they were previously, it's as though the music is showing us another side of the theme, rather like an important personage in a novel, returning but transformed after various adventures with other people. For yet another point of view on the same material, let's look within the development. Here it appears in the bass as counterpoint with some contrasting material. This kind of thing happens elsewhere in the movement as well. In fact, most of the thematic material in this movement continually appears in varied moods and contexts. Unlike the typical ways in which material returns in classical symphonies, here there's much more variety of character and context. The effect of this is to intensify and enlarge the emotional range of the piece, making it more restless and dramatic. This movement lasts about 18 minutes, and we can see why it needs to be so long, given all this emotional upheaval. If you examine the evolution of the other themes and motives in this movement, they are similarly developed and transformed. What's interesting about this is that, unlike, say, the Chopin Nocturne Opus 55 we looked at in our last lesson, material returns here is not only different in duration, but also in character. In other words, the idea of recapitulation now implies more continuous, developing transformation. The form overall has become more dynamic and more dramatic. As we said last time, the point of all this for the aspiring composer is to realize that there are many degrees and kinds of recapitulation, as the composer has to think them through when deciding how to structure a given work. It's very rare to have a large piece with no recapitulation at all, but deciding how much to recapitulate and whether to vary it or to prepare it differently, these are important formal questions to be dealt with. If, on the other hand, one decides never to repeat important material, that means sacrificing an immensely powerful tool in musical form. Listeners are sensitive to degrees of novelty, and the feeling of coming home after a musical adventure can be very appealing. On the other hand, the more changes one makes in a recapitulation or repetition, the less salient the connection with the original becomes. Salience will be the topic of my next video.